Beautiful. It's 2:03. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. We're going to get this thing going. So I'm going to share my screen here. Um, and let's see, I lost all my Zoom friends. There you go. Perfect. So we're going to talk about physical risk assessments today. I'll walk through the agenda and what we're going to do. As always, if you have questions, ask them throughout. There's a Q&A and there's a chat enabled in the actual chat. So ask away and we will make this fun and interactive. So let's get into it. Physical risk assessments. So here's what we're going to talk about today. Who we are and why we're talking about this, why you actually need this, what risks exist and what we're talking about generally. I'll walk you through how to do this manually. So if you were a company who just had zero budget and a lot of time on your hands, half of that is usually true. Then you can, I'll give you the cheat code and you can see how to do this. And I'll show you what Beehive actually does. And then if we have time at the end, I can show you a few ways you might use this information, use these results. So let's get into it and talk about who are we. So my name is Adriel. I'm the CEO of a company called Beehive, and we help our customers measure physical and transition risks and publish their climate risk reports to comply with legislation such as California's SB 261 or CSRD. So why do this? Like, why are we talking about physical risk assessments? Who actually needs to do this? So if you are a company with more than $500 million in revenue and you do business in California and you're US based, you have to publish at the end of this year what's called a climate related financial risk report, often in line with the TCFD. Actually, let me pull up the actual text here, which I should have done. This is the law that we care about. So this law is called SB 261. If you want to look it up, by January 1st of this year, you need to, if you are a company that does $500 million in revenue, you have to publish this report in line with the TCFD. And so what does the TCFD actually ask for? This is the guidelines of the TCFD, the implementing guidance, and it has 4 sections, 11 questions. One of the questions here is specifically describe the resilience of your organization, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios. So you are going to be talking about what those risks are. You are also going to say, describe the climate-related risks and opportunities that you've identified. So those are a couple of different areas in which you're going to have to do this scenario analysis on physical risks. And so what that looks like in practice, I'm going to show you a few outputs just as examples. So I pulled up climate risk reports from Equinix, which is like a data center management company, from Expedia, and from GitLab. None clients, just showing you examples. So Equinix did a lot of work here. They're a data center company, so obviously physical risks are really impactful. Those are short-term risks, like a wildfire can cause a disruption in data center service, and that's a big problem. These are also longer-term, what's called chronic risks. And this might mean that as global warming increases in certain region, energy costs are going to slowly increase, which will increase their operating costs. And you'll see that they actually did a lot of this work, and they talked about these physical acute risks with increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events, these physical risks causing long-term problems in the company. And they give a bunch of examples throughout the report, and then they get them really specifically. So they looked at drought and they looked at flooding, which are really important for data centers. So you want to look at the risks particularly relevant to your business and how they did this scenario analysis. We won't get into too many of the details, but they use something called RCPs instead of SSPs. They're all fairly similar. But then they talked a lot about the specifics of how they analyze drought, what they're observing, what they're doing with this, and what implications risks like this might have to them. That's an example from Equinix. Another example is Expedia, and I'll zoom in here. This is Expedia's report. And there's a couple interesting things that they did here. So they highlighted, acute risks and chronic risks, things that you might imagine, how acute weather disasters could impact people's abilities to work from home, or changes in precipitation might negatively impact tourism in high-risk areas. So they discussed things like that and what impacts they might have to the business, ranging from medium term to long term. But they also went much deeper. So they actually highlighted priority physical risks, these acute, severe weather events. And they assessed this in multiple scenarios, like they talked about multiple warming scenarios. We've got 41 different locations all over the world. So some of these are offices, but some of these are travel destinations because if they do a lot of hotel business or airline business in a Caribbean island, and they think that there's a chance that increased disasters in that island make travel less desirable, both because who wants to go to a place where there's going to be a terrible storm, but also after a terrible storm, like we've seen over and over and over again in Puerto Rico and in Haiti and many other islands, it is a long recovery process before tourism picks back up. So they use these SSPs, these socioeconomic pathways, and they talked about the risks that might happen here due to a number of floods, precipitation, flood risk, cyclone risk, and they looked at a lot of that. They went even deeper. So this is one of the better examples where they said what impact is going to have on their operations. So physical risk events might impact their facilities, and there's other risks that they talked about here. So that's an example of how Expedia did this. Now, the last one I want to highlight is GitLab. They did something interesting. A lot of this is standard. You see these physical risks. They'll, further down in here, they talk about physical risk scenario analysis and how they looked at these different SSPs. Somewhere in here, they talk about acute and chronic risks. But one thing that they did that was interesting, if I can find my spot here, is GitLab is a fully remote company. I don't think they actually have any offices. They might, yeah, they're all remote. And so for them, offices don't really matter, but they have employees all over the world. And so what they did is they looked at hotspots where they have team members. So they did an analysis that said, what are the 10 areas in which we have the highest concentration of employees all over the world? And they sort of picked a area based on that. So if they have employees all over London and the surrounding suburbs, they might say, oh, let's just look at London. And they reviewed risk to people in those areas, which is a really time-consuming process to do with a consulting service. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, or certainly to do on your own, because it's hard to do like Expedia did for 41 locations. It's even harder to do for employees all over the world. And just saying, what is London's risk doesn't really capture all the areas in and around London. Because if you're London right on the Thames River, or you're London far inland in some suburb, you're going to have very, very different sorts of risks. So those are a few examples of why you're doing this and what those outputs look like. Now, when we talk about risks, a little iced tea break. When we talk about risks, these are some of the examples of risks you might want to consider. So acute risks and chronic risks. And again, for the purposes of this presentation, we're just focusing on physical risks. There's a whole nother segment called transition risks, which we're actually doing a webinar about sometime in May. So you can check that out. But around physical risks, these are some of the categories you might want to look at. You want to see these acute risks, things like wildfires and floods, and chronic risks, things like sea level rise and global warming. And so those are the things you want to analyze. You want to look at this in multiple time horizons and scenarios. So time horizons meaning what do wildfires be like in the short term, how they change in the medium term, maybe that's 10 years from now. What about in the long term? Maybe that's through 2050. Some companies go all the way out through 2100. I think for the most part, that's a big waste of time and resources. 2100 cities might plan on 2100 timescales, but even like a real estate company that even if it buys a building, let alone signs a lease, it probably doesn't expect to own that building, even if it's building it from the ground up for more than 30 years or so. So I think 30 years is usually the extent of this long-term risk you might want to consider. And so to what assets, right? You talk about wildfires or floods or sea level rise. What are we talking about that in the context of? So I want to give you 5 examples of 5 disasters that influence 5 different asset types. And you can use this as inspiration for your own company. And I see, by the way, a few people have joined in the last couple of minutes. Welcome. You're welcome to throw questions in the chat or into the Q&A as we go along. So here's our 5 little stories here. I think I pulled them up here. So offices. Hurricane Helene happened last fall. There's a story of EJ Victor, which is a big furniture retailer, how it damaged it. And they talked about how weeks after the disaster, they remained in recovery mode, and they didn't even anticipate resuming manufacturing of this until months later. So that was a really big material issue. So if this impacts your offices or factories or manufacturing areas, I sort of bucketed those into one and call it like physical HQ-esque locations. That creates real issues. One other story I didn't pull up here, but you might remember the story last year when Hurricane Helene as well hit, and the largest baby for no, I was IV. The largest like IV fluid manufacturer had two factories in the same region in North Carolina, and they both went down, which caused an IV fluid shortage. So that's a company that was really impacted by one set of disasters, and it just didn't have the right either physical security, flood walls, reinforced roofs to protect from it, or the right processes. All right, so if this gets knocked down, do we have a secondary supplier? That's one example. Another example of what you might want to review is damage to, right, is this one employees that we're doing? Yes, damage to employees. So the Los Angeles fires, obviously very devastating. Many millions of people in that region were impacted by this. Hundreds of thousands had to evacuate homes. Disney, who has a large park, you might have heard of it, in the Los Angeles area, donated $15 million to wildfire recovery efforts. And that's because they had thousands of employees in that area who were impacted by these fires. Um, this is a slightly older article. It actually ended up being more than this in the end. But many people died. Many tens or hundreds of thousands had to evacuate. And so Disney, when it does its reviews, might look at what is the risk to its employees. And if one devastating event like this happens, how much do they need to budget for it? Where does the money come from? How do they get that money out really fast? Who does that money go to? Does it go directly to the employees? Does it go to the Red Cross in that area? They spent a lot of time setting this up, and as you can see, it cost them $15 million in donations. Next example of an asset you might want to consider is data centers. For many modern cloud-based companies, data centers are a huge, huge part of your risk stack. And whether you're using cloud data centers through GCP or AWS, or they're your own data centers, there's big issues here. So Hurricane Sandy, for my New York friends, you'll probably remember this, in 2012, really destroyed New York, Manhattan, Long Island. And it hit two data centers really badly, which created outages. And then somewhere in here, it talks about how that knocked out and stopped different companies from running. So they struggled to resume operations here. There was basement level flooding due to this. Customers of one of these companies were knocked offline. So it created really, really big issues. Multiple companies reported data centers being offline. So that's another example of where, hey, if something happens to this single point of failure area, do you have good redundancies? Do you have a good plan? Some people with very significant amounts of private customer data. So if you're in healthcare, if you are a law firm, if you're a security company, you might have on-site servers and data centers, and you might want to keep all that data locally instead of in the cloud. And so if something happens, you want to be very careful. The next example is on supply chain. This sort of ties into those factory examples I was giving earlier. Obviously, if you buy IV fluid and a provider of IV fluid gets hurt, then you should know about that risk and the fact that they might not have redundancies. There's many, many examples here. So one of the bigger ones they talk about here is the earthquake and tsunami that hit Japan. If you remember the nuclear disaster that happened back in 2011, this is a huge issue, and especially an issue for automotive businesses, because Japanese companies famously have just-in-time inventory, which means they try not to overproduce any products, so they limit warehousing, which ruined their entire supply chain. And so they could actually even sell cars in the United States because of these Japanese tsunamis and earthquakes that happened. So that's an example of supply chain issues. There's many more that they go into here. And then the last one I wanted to talk about is a story that I won't name the customer of, or the company here, but it's about how your customers might get impacted. So I know a large payroll company, payroll provider that serves SMBs. So they have many tens of thousands of small businesses who run payroll through their software. And the Los Angeles fires forced 600 of their customers to pause payroll. Now, for a payroll company, if 600 customers automatically pause payroll and you don't make any money for a month or so, or even more, if a florist flower shop burned down and it takes 3 months or 4 months to reopen, you're pausing payroll for quite a while. If that happens, that's a significant and material issue. And so a company like that wants to be able to understand the risk to its customers and to say, hey, do I have any regions where my customers could be impacted in a way that hurts my income? Another example is more of a hypothetical, but if you imagine a company that serves restaurants, like we all know Toast, a company that does whatever, big vertical SaaS company in restaurants, publicly traded. They help restaurants with payroll and checkout and credit cards. Imagine if New Orleans is a really big market for Toast, where they do many millions in revenue. And then all of a sudden, a hurricane happens in New Orleans and not only shuts down restaurants who need to rebuild, but shuts down tourism that drives those restaurants to have revenue. Toast's revenue could be deeply impacted. And so what it might want to do is to understand, hey, what would the impact of a hypothetical hurricane in New Orleans be to our business? And then how can we reduce the amount of time that we are offline? And if we have time and you guys are interested, we can talk about a few ways in which you might reduce the risk of that. But these are ways you might want to be measuring physical risk, and that's the focus of this. So we talked a little about what kind of risks you're looking at, what you're doing with them, and what assets they might impact. How might you want to, if you wanted to, do this on your own? So, by the way, I don't know if you guys ever tried Swoon, but I have a can a day now. It's like a iced tea with no sugar. I'm sure it's going to give me cancer in like 3 weeks, but yeah, shout out to Swoon. Okay. So there's a few resources if you want to do this on your own that you can sort of Google around and make this work. I'm going to show you one for floods and one for wildfire. So there's something called WRI Aqueduct, and it's a great tool, very credible. And so what you can do in here is you can see this global map, and you can say, hey, do I want to see water stress? Or do I want to see riverine flooding or coastal flooding? And so then you can say in here, let's see, let's find North America as an example. You could say, hey, if I'm looking at, let's look at drought. If I'm looking at drought, you can't enter like your own locations in here, but if I'm looking at drought, all right, maybe I have an office in Austin. So then we have to find Austin, or is it somewhere south of Dallas, I think. There you go, I found it. You have to find Austin and be like, all right, Austin, I can't click in here. Oh yeah, you can. You can put a pin in there. So the Gulf Coast has medium drought risk. And what kind of coastal flood risk does it have? Click again. Low, of course, it's not anywhere near a coast. Riverine flood risk low. So you can just like go down the list here. Water stress seems to be medium to high. You can go down the list here and say, all right, that was Austin. Now let's go to my other office in Chicago, and you'd come here. Where's Chicago? You come here to Chicago, and you put your little pin in there. All right, so high water stress and riverine flood risk is kind of medium depending on where your office is, and you can click around and do that. So that's one way you can do that for water risks and floods and droughts. And this is super credible, right? It comes from the WRI. I think they sort of source things a little bit if you want to see a research paper. Not that you would, but the reason I bring that up is because since this is an investor report, you want to have confidence where it comes from, and maybe writing that you use the WRI is good enough. But having some sort of context here is good. So this is great because you can click around, do it. It's free. Just Google WRI Aqueduct, and you can do it that way. You're not going to do this for like all your employees, or even if you have dozens of offices. Like, you're certainly welcome to. The one for wildfires, and WRI, by the way, is great because it is global. And they did a really good job making it so. So, you can come to Europe and Asia and wherever else you have employees, offices, people, and do the same thing. Like you find Paris, you click around. So that's cool. You can do the same thing for wildfire risk with wildfirerisk.org. It is only in the United States, but you can type it. Well, let's do more like Los Angeles. Let's go East Los Angeles. And it shows you what the risk is in East Los Angeles. So, medium risk in East Los Angeles. And then you can search. I don't think you can do zip codes, right? No, you can't do zip codes. And you can't do addresses either. So, 101 Broad. Yeah, you can't do addresses either. But you can do like Palo Alto. Whatever Dos Palo Altos is, we'll see that risk. Looks like low risk to homes in Merced County and Dos Palos Y, whatever that is. So you can do that at all. Similarly to how you did it for WRI, you can come in here, you can search for Austin, Texas, Austin County, Texas, and say that there's a medium risk of wildfire, and you can cite this as your source wherever you do that. It's got some limits. It is only in the United States. And you also, for each of these, I don't think you can do, oh, you can do some projections in here. So 20, 30, 50, 80. And you kind of have scenarios. So pessimistic, optimistic, BAU. So that's great. So you can do that really easily in WRI. Again, really great tool. I don't think you can do that here. So the scenarios are not available. Yeah, the scenarios are not available in here. Let's see what this does. Oh, cool. So you can do, oh, you can't do this on a map. This is just for Austin. Can I zoom all the way out? We're learning this stuff together. Yeah, you can kind of, yeah, like wildfire risk is red everywhere, apparently. Can you do time? Oh, this is cool. I have some pretty little data visualizations based on counties. That's pretty cool. And then, yeah, you can't do any scenario analysis. So that's one way that you might do this for free. You could also obviously use ChatGPT. So, and again, this one you could only do in the United States. You might be able to find some internationally. I looked a little bit, but I couldn't find anything easily. You could use ChatGPT. So you can take all the addresses where you have offices. If you think you should do data centers or employees, you can type in zip codes. I just did an example here. I typed in an office in San Francisco and an office in Ireland, and I asked to look at time horizons that are 1, 10, and 30 years in these climate scenarios, and I asked it to cite sources and rank it on a scale of 1 to 7 just to give it some sort of guidance. So you can do this. So we'll do this and we'll see what it comes up with. And I'm sure it'll be fine, right? This is saying SOMA in San Francisco is low risk and, it doesn't really change much in this direct area, even though surrounding region might change. And so you can do this, right? Wildfire floods. Here you go. The sources here is what I think is really important. Remember that this is for investor reports and legal reports. They're citing Dublin Docklands.Ireland as their source. So I'm not sure if this is the type of credible source that you would want to put into one of your reports, but obviously something ChatGPT, totally an option. It gives you whatever the strategic for the Puebla West planning scheme is. So cool. So you can do that if you're comfortable with it. So those are all options of how you can do this for free. I'll show you briefly what you can do with Beehive. So this is the Beehive software. What you're able to do is automatically drop in assets like offices, employees, and data centers all over the world. So here's the United States, here's the UK and Ireland, here's India. For any of these geographies, you can immediately see risks from wildfires or from floods. You can get this on a risk map that looks a little bit like WRI. Here's heat, here's wildfires. And for any one of these risks, and I think this is really important. So not only did this all happen really quickly, you dropped it in, you get those results, and more geographies are coming. But for any one of these risks, there's an audit trail that explains why the risk is what it is. And this is super important because we're talking about an investor-facing report and a legal report, citing, Dublin. Oh, it looks like it doesn't even load that page that ChatGPT use. But citing that, Dublin Docklands.ie in your report is probably not what you want to do. But everything has an audit trail, and if this changes over time, this all has an audit trail explaining that the reason this is a 7 out of 7 risk is because we expect this many days a year with maximum temperatures of whatever, and so on. And so that can make it really, really easy to get really fast auditable information. For any of these risk types, we also share very transparently about how we built these. So we share where the data sources came from. We share the projection models we use. We explain why we score data as we score it. And so this hopefully builds a lot of credibility in your reports where you say, if I'm going to disclose that X amount of employees that live in high risk areas or that I have zero risk from anything, I better have confidence in why I'm disclosing that. Another cool thing you can do inside of Beehive, so there's like the fact that it all takes 2 seconds, the fact that you can visualize it all, the fact that it has an audit trail. You can see it in the map mode as well as in this table mode. And this is really valuable because maybe you want to source or search for, the zip code in which your CEO lives. Maybe excuse me, maybe you know that your CEO lives in a particular zip code. So, let's find them and see what risks exist to your CEO and whether you should be responsive to that. Or maybe you want to filter this by saying, I just want to look at offices in the United States, focusing on wildfire risk. Cool. Like here's the wildfire risks and what they are. Maybe you only want to focus on leased offices or other types that you've set up. And then you can export all this as a CSV. And so that becomes really useful for you to do deeper analysis that we don't support currently in the platform. But if you want to quantify the risk, if you want to set different parameters, if you want to create different charts to be able to show your board or your boss or put into different reports, you're able to do all that in here. So hopefully that simplifies a lot of the work here. So again, the goals of Beehive are do a couple things. One, give you a really fast way to upload all this data. So you don't have to go click around and search and do the desktop research. Two, give you an auditable response. So both by being transparent about how these models get created and by sharing an audit trail for any one of these scores. You can say, this is why the score is what it is. And here's how it, goes up a little bit over time because of here's what's expected. And then three, allow you to actually use this data to make decisions and build resilience strategies. So you can say, just show me the scores that are, high risk from heat. And I want in the medium term because I'm thinking about, building a new office, whatever you're doing there. So that's a little bit about Beehive. I know there's some folks on here who are probably curious in this, but this is a bit of the roadmap about how we're building out international as well as additional risks. So we'll be launching much of Europe later this month, expanding Europe and Canada next month, a bunch of Asia and Australia in June, and then some Middle East, South America, Southeast Asia after that. Currently, we support 3 risk types, and we'll be adding at least 3 others this summer. So hopefully that helps. All right. So, excuse me. Nice tea, man. So good. So, we talked about why you're doing this, the compliance reports, what these look like in their final output form, how you do this yourself for free, what Beehive looks like. Happy to answer any questions if folks have them. Usually I was told I should just sit in silence for a minute because sometimes it takes a minute or two to build up some courage. I'm not very good at sitting in silence, but if folks have questions, you can type them into the chat or put them into the Q&A. And if not, I'll show you one more thing, just sort of about how you might use this data to prepare, but I will pause here for a moment. Okay, if you're typing a question, feel free to keep typing in. That's as long as I can stay quiet. So, how do you like act on this? How do you respond? I won't spend too much time on this. We've spent a whole webinar on it in the follow-up email that you'll get. I'll link to the webinar. But here's some things you can do before disaster strikes, while a disaster is striking, and then afterwards. So beforehand, a lot of this focuses on employee safety because that was the last webinar. But before, you can do some training, you can provide certain equipment, and you can review insurance. So around training, tell your employees how to be safe. You probably do this in so many other ways around cybersecurity and internet safety and internal workforce policies around things like sexual harassment. You can provide training tools about how to handle a wildfire or a hurricane or a tornado and stay safe. And actually, someone just emailed me an hour ago. A tornado is happening right now in the Midwest, and already there's people who died. And it's hitting some major cities. So providing that training and customizing it to the person based on where they live is helpful. So don't send the wildfire training to someone who lives in New York City, and don't send the hurricane training to somebody who lives in Kansas. You want to send tornado training to Kansas, wildfires in LA, and some hurricanes and floods in New York. So customize that training. You can provide equipment, things like sending them, you send them a lot of swag. You do this already. If you know they live in a high risk area, only focusing on people who live in the highest risk areas for wildfires or whatever, just send it to these 11 people a first aid kit, or maybe it's everyone who has risk from any of these disasters. So you might come in here and say, hey, I'm only going to send first aid kits to employees who, from any of these, it's auto checked for all of them, has the highest risk. And so that's 119 zip codes. I'm going to send this to people in 119 zip codes, not to, the 500 zip codes I have in total in here. So that's one way to do this. Oh, someone just asked a question. So they asked, what controls are in place to ensure that data is auditable and accurate in Beehive's AI-driven system? What feedback have you received from the audit teams of clients of yours? Great question. So around controls to ensure that the data is auditable, again, we're talking specifically about the climate models that we built. I think the main things that we do, well, this first saying like, what is a climate model? And I think anybody who says a climate model is a crystal ball into the future is incorrect and misleading. Just because I say this is where wildfires are likely does not mean this is where wildfires are going to happen. So I think the first part is setting some expectations. The purpose of these models is not to accurately predict that wildfires can only happen in this weirdly shaped little J, and no, they'll never happen here. It just means here there's high likelihood of damage. And so that's the first thing is you need to be very honest about what these are doing. These are ways for you to strategize and say, we're pretty confident a wildfire is not going to happen here. And we're, pretty confident that the middle of the country is not going to flood unless you're directly on a river, maybe. So we're pretty confident about those things. But so you should focus your flood attention here. You should focus your, oops, I don't know what I'm about to do. You should focus your heat attention here. And maybe that changes a bit in the long term as that expands. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this audit trail, I think is really important. And customers really appreciate, you asked what feedback have you received from audit teams. I think they like seeing this. They like seeing, oh, this is why. And not because they're climate scientists who knows what to make of this, and actually floods is an even better example. Not because they understand what it means to have negative 2% rise and increase in 0.03% hurricane frequency. Like that's not the point. They're just saying, oh, at least we know where this comes from. Now, what they like more of is even better documentation. So, for example, do I have this? Yeah. So we have this like climate model documentation where we talked about what hazards we cover, what SSPs, where this comes from, how we build wildfire models. This is this needs to be better. So I think the appreciation is around, oh, great, they're transparent, there's an auditor, there's something I can point to, but we want to continue getting better and better, and customers are asking us to get better and better at better documenting how these models work so they can build even more confidence. So I hope that's helpful. So first thing, this is not a perfect predictor. This is just supposed to guide your thinking. Second thing is we try to be as transparent as possible with these audit trails and with existing docs. And where we can improve is to continue to improve on those docs. Thank you for the question. So yeah, so those are some of the things you can do before a disaster. Again, folks have other questions, come and ask. Now, during a disaster, as the disaster is happening, there's a bunch that you can do. I won't dive into all of this, but one example is software to actually help you notify of disasters. One thing that's happening as FEMA and NOAA and governments and federal government agencies lose funding is that a lot of the money they spend actually goes to counties to better and the National Weather Service, but the local departments of that National Weather Service to monitor risks as they develop. And if they lose that funding, they're going to be worse at alerting local people about where risks are likely. And so you can invest in software that exists in the private markets to take the place of those public goods. For what it's worth, I think those should be public goods, but who am I to say? To take the place of that to keep employees safe. So that's one way you can invest in that. And there's a company called Everbridge that does a pretty good job there, and a few others. And then after, what happens after the disaster? Well, the first thing that really the main thing I want to focus on is setting a plan for how you respond. A lot of companies I talk to say that every time a disaster happens, just as a reminder, there have been last year in the United States, there were 27 disasters, natural disasters that cost over $1 billion each. So every 10 days or so, 12 days, there was a major natural disaster. And that creates a lot of whiplash. Because every 12 days, you're hearing from somebody different. First, there was a wildfire. So you heard from folks in LA. Then there was a hurricane. So you heard from folks in New York. Then there was a tornado. So people in the Midwest reached out. And then all of a sudden, a heat wave made energy costs go up here. Like there's something different every 10 days, which creates a lot of whiplash. And you don't know if your customers are hurt or if your employees are hurt or what happened. Like you need to create a plan. So that's the main thing I'd focus on here is saying start really small and just say, our plan is to help when we have more than 50 employees in an area where a category 4 hurricane has hit. Our plan is to automatically add $500 to their paycheck to help them with disaster relief, or to automatically donate $100 per employee to the Red Cross, or to automatically match any donation. And just have this one plan that's been approved. Don't try to solve for every disaster and every type. And what about employees? What about customers? What about my offices? Just pick one and set up that plan. And then, unfortunately, that plan will be tested really, really soon. Give it 12 days. Something's going to test that plan. That's just in the US. Obviously, internationally, that happens. Numbers bigger. So that was a lot. Hopefully that was helpful. I'm happy to stay on if there's any questions. If there's not, then that's totally okay. Next week, just so you guys know, the webinar we're hosting, I think this one is with Valvoline. Yep. So next week's we're hosting an event with Valvoline. Ashley Scott is wonderful. She runs ESG for Valvoline, and she'll be talking about how they handle climate risks and a bunch of their other ESG work. The week after is an interview with Mike Hauer, who's one of the top report writers and communication professionals in sustainability. So I'll send you a follow-up email with this recording, with some of those other events, and I hope to see you there. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you around. Bye.